Hey, everyone. Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle under the blankets, shift your pillow until it feels just right. Maybe unclench your jaw if it's been pretending to be a medieval bear trap all day. Tonight, we're drifting back to meet a group of historical figures who were, quite literally, paid to make sure other people didn't wake up the next morning. Executioners. Yes, the quiet professionals of legally sanctioned doom. They're easy to imagine as raging sadists, covered in blood, cackling while sharpening their axes. Except reality, as usual, was far stranger, and somehow, even more depressing. Most executioners weren't villains by choice. They were trapped in the role, born into it, or cornered into it by sheer bad luck. So tonight's gentle bedtime exploration is less, how could they be so cruel? And more, how on earth did they buy groceries after work without causing a riot? Because that was the real problem. It turns out the hardest part of being an executioner wasn't the execution. It was going outside afterward. Let's drift back to medieval Europe, where everyone claimed to be deeply Christian and devoted to forgiveness, but also refused to let the town executioner sit near them, touch anything they ate, or make eye contact for too long in case sin was contagious. Executioners existed in a sort of legal twilight zone, hired by the city, paid by the crown, yet treated like mildly radioactive raccoons wearing human clothes. You were essential, but also disgusting, like a toilet, but with opinions. Becoming an executioner, the world's worst career counseling session. No one aspired to become an executioner. There were no university programs. No childhood dreams of, when I grow up, I want to decapitate people for administrative purposes. Usually, the role came about through one of three highly unfortunate life circumstances. Option 1. You committed a crime yourself. Many executioners were former criminals who were offered a lovely career ultimatum: perform the execution or be executed. Clean up someone else's mess or become part of it. If you accepted, congratulations. You now had a job, a salary, and the permanent social status of walking biohazard. Option 2. Your dad did it. Executioner roles often became hereditary, which sounds prestigious if you ignore everything about it. Sons of executioners inherited both the profession and the lifelong shunning. Imagine being 8 years old and trying to participate in childhood games, only for the other kids to explain, very politely, that your father beheads people for money, and therefore you cannot be trusted with marbles. Option 3. No one else would do it. Sometimes, local officials simply appointed the town's most physically capable, least politically connected resident. If you were tall, quiet, and had no powerful friends, boom, new job. Here's your axe. Please dispose of sinners on Wednesdays. No dental insurance. The pay was surprisingly good and also terrible. Now, being feared and avoided did come with one upside. Executioners were usually quite well paid. Cities understood that no one would volunteer to legally disassemble people without some strong financial motivation. So executioners often received salaries, housing, and, surprisingly, tax exemptions. Some even received the right to confiscate the belongings of the people they executed, which was sort of like a rewards program, but morally confusing. Congratulations, you just removed Gregor the counterfeiter. Please enjoy his shoes and half-eaten onion. However, there was one significant catch. People refused to trade with them. You could be wealthy in theory, wealthy on paper, but still unable to buy bread because the baker politely explained that while he supports law and justice, he does not wish to handle coins previously touched by hands that have more blood on them than yeast. So many executioners had to send assistants or even wives to make purchases on their behalf. Some wore gloves while paying to avoid contaminating coins with execution juice, which is not a phrase historians use, but perhaps they should. So, where did they live? Executioners were typically given houses at the edge of town. Literally, physically placed on the border between civilization and please don't bother us. They weren't quite citizens. They weren't quite outlaws. They were legally tolerated, geographically exiled. Their homes often doubled as brothels, butcher shops, or veterinary clinics, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval moral hierarchy. You may not be pure enough to shake hands with the mayor, but you are acceptable to provide sausages and medically examine goats. And yes, executioners were often skilled in butchery and medical procedures. Because apparently, when your primary profession involves cutting things apart, people assume you're qualified to also sew things back together. It was a strange loop of societal logic. Hey, didn't you just remove a man's head? Yes. Excellent. Can you remove this cow's wart? The public performance of death. The job itself was oddly bureaucratic. Executions were not chaotic or improvised. They were scheduled events, announced in advance. People showed up with snacks. Vendors sold food. Parents brought their children. Early modern Europe was deeply committed to multitasking morality with entertainment. Executioners were expected to perform with precision. 1 clean stroke was ideal. 2 was bad form. 3 or more. Complete humiliation. There are recorded cases of botched beheadings where the crowd booed. As if the executioner were a medieval stand-up comedian who forgot the punchline. One executioner in the 16th century took 13 strikes to fully remove a noblewoman's head. 13. By the final blow, even the axe was emotionally exhausted. Imagine the pressure. You're already hated, already avoided, and now you're expected to execute people with the speed and accuracy of a professional fruit ninja. If you slip up, not only does your victim suffer, you lose Yelp stars with the mob. So, how did they live with themselves? Religiously? Many felt they were carrying out divine justice. Some executioners prayed extensively before each act, asking for forgiveness for both themselves and their subject. Others tried not to reflect on it at all. Dissociation, the original coping mechanism. Some treated it as pure professionalism, a duty, a trade, no different from a tanner or a gravedigger. Someone had to do it. Better me than someone unskilled. And occasionally, executioners got weirdly popular. If they were skilled, efficient, and respectful to the condemned, citizens sometimes developed a reluctant fondness for them. Like when your dentist is extremely good at not hurting you. You don't like them, but you trust them. Mostly. There are even rare cases of executioners being beloved. One French executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, the man who guillotined King Louis XVI, was known for being calm, polite, and surprisingly empathetic. After retiring, he opened a shop. People, hesitantly, began to visit. He became almost normal. Almost. Let's drift a little deeper into our quiet little world of legally sanctioned isolation. We now arrive at one of history's least discussed professions, being married to the executioner. Because while the executioner himself was feared, avoided, and occasionally booed for underperforming at head removal, someone still had to sit across from him at dinner and say, "So, how is work?" Courtship, but make it socially radioactive. Executioners rarely had the luxury of choosing a spouse in the conventional sense. No respectable family wanted to send their darling daughter off to live with the man who makes Thursdays uncomfortable. So executioners usually married in one of 4 ways. Option 1. They married within their own cursed lineage. Executioner families intermarried with other executioner families. Yes, dynastic alliances. But instead of uniting kingdoms, they united people who couldn't shop at normal bakeries. Their weddings were probably small, possibly catered by themselves. Option 2. They married widows and outcasts. Women already on society's fringe. Widows, sex workers, or those with no dowry might accept an executioner's proposal. Being shunned slightly more wasn't too much of a downgrade from being shunned slightly less. Option 3. They were assigned a wife by the local court. In rare cases, local officials would select a woman considered suitable, which is diplomatic phrasing for someone they wouldn't miss. Option 4. They paid handsomely for the privilege. Executioners sometimes offered significant financial incentives. Not a dowry, more like hazard pay. Marry me, and I promise stability, housing, and minimal decapitation in the home. Domestic life in the house of headsman and wife. Despite all the grimness, many historical accounts suggest that executioner households were surprisingly normal, just heavily avoided. Meals were shared.
Pets were kept.
Children were raised. Chickens were fed. Someone swept the floor, while someone else sharpened tools on the porch. Except no one ever came over. Birthday parties were family only. Holidays were extremely private. Trick-or-treating was not a thing, but if it were, their house would be the one everyone avoided, even if they gave out full-sized candy bars. Most executioner wives were also business partners. Since their husbands could not buy or sell goods without social backlash, the wives handled trade. They bought bread, sold leather, negotiated with farmers. Some even dealt in medicine and cosmetics, which feels deeply ironic. Here's the ointment your husband needs. And yes, I know what my husband does. Let's both pretend we're fine. And what about affection? Surprisingly, some historical records hint at very devoted marriages. Letters survive from a few executioners expressing genuine love and gratitude toward their wives, often thanking them for enduring the constant isolation. It's hard to say whether these marriages were warm or resigned. Probably a mix. There's a certain intimacy in being ostracized together. Two people sitting quietly at the edge of town, sharing soup, slightly haunted, but together. The children of executioners, legally employed, socially screwed. Now let's drift over to the executioner's children, who had the unique experience of being born guilty of nothing, except someone else's job. Most towns enforced strict social boundaries. Executioner children could not attend public schools. They were not allowed to worship in the same pews. They were barred from most guilds. So the paths available to them were: become executioners themselves, the family business; marry another outcast; leave town entirely and lie about their background. Number 3 was the dream. Many children tried to escape their legacy by moving to another city and pretending to be from a different family. Unfortunately, records traveled. Gossip traveled faster. Someone always knew someone whose cousin once visited your cursed village and remembered your last name. Some kids succeeded. Most didn't. Romance? Technically possible. Practically difficult. Courtship for executioners' sons and daughters was complicated. Imagine approaching someone you fancy. You smile, offer a greeting, perhaps a flower. They respond with, "Aren't you the one whose father boiled that man alive? My mother says I will catch moral fungus if I speak to you too long." It didn't help that people believed executioners had unclean blood. Not metaphorically, literally cursed, which meant marriages were usually arranged within the small social circle of gravediggers, butchers, tanners, and lepers, the goth friend group of the medieval world, when executioners became local celebrities. Now and then, however, everything flipped. If an executioner was especially skilled, clean strokes, calm demeanor, maybe a nice hat, public opinion could shift. Executioners of major cities like Paris or Nuremberg became strange, unofficial mascots. People whispered about them. Some admired their composure. Even nobles requested private audiences, not to be executed, just to chat. One executioner in Augsburg became so famous that young women reportedly sent him love letters, which must have been flattering and horrifying in equal measure. No records confirm whether he reciprocated. Hopefully not with a courier axe. Let's drift onward, quietly, to one of history's most unintentionally poetic contradictions: the executioner as healer. Because despite being shunned as morally toxic, executioners were often highly knowledgeable in anatomy. After all, they spent a great deal of time observing what the insides of people looked like, usually for unfortunate reasons. But knowledge is knowledge. So naturally, people began to think, if he can take bodies apart so efficiently, perhaps he can also put them back together. And thus emerged one of history's strangest side professions: executioners doubling as physicians, surgeons, dentists, and most curiously, miracle healers. Official job title: head taker. Unofficial job title: orthopedic specialist. It turns out medieval Europe didn't have many licensed surgeons, mostly because going to medical school involved studying astrology and occasionally washing your hands. So when someone dislocated a shoulder, broke an ankle, or inconveniently stabbed themselves while attempting to impress someone with their dagger skills, who could they turn to? Not the priest. He offered spiritual wellness, not practical bone alignment. not the local barber. He'd shave your beard and then possibly your entire skin layer. So, who was left? The man who knew exactly how much pressure a joint could take before snapping. Executioners became experts at setting fractures, lancing boils, stitching wounds, and even developing herbal balms to stop infection. Some created trademark remedies. People whispered that their salves were infused with special energy, which is a polite way of saying, this ointment probably contains powdered human parts, but it works, so let's not ask. The hangman's secret ingredient, human fat. Let's tread gently here. Softly. Executioners, due to their rather exclusive access to materials, often became producers of medicinal goods derived from the deceased. Most notably, hangman salve, a popular folk cure for joint pain, cramps, and mysterious ailments. Its main ingredient? Human fat, usually taken from recently executed criminals. Yes. History, once again, is not subtle. People who feared the executioner would still sneak to his house at dusk and whisper, "Do you have any of that ointment for my knees?" No hugging, no handshakes, just a discreet fat-based transaction followed by a hurried walk home while pretending not to believe in ghosts. I'll execute you at noon and cure your sciatica at 4. Executioners balanced dual reputations. By morning, they were government-sanctioned doom. By evening, medical consultants. Residents would avoid them in the marketplace, but gladly remove their shirts in private to get their spine adjusted. Some even traveled from town to town offering services as bone setters and leech specialists, which is possibly the only career where hearing, "Yes, that's the man who flayed my cousin," could be followed by, "But he fixed my shoulder, so he's fine." The surprisingly beloved executioner of Nuremberg. Let's briefly float over to 16th century Germany to meet one of history's most unexpectedly wholesome figures. Franz Schmidt, the executioner of Nuremberg. Unlike the stereotypical grim butcher, Schmidt kept a detailed diary of every execution he performed. Not just the act, but the backstory of each condemned person. He wrote with startling empathy, often lamenting their lives and misfortunes. When he wasn't removing heads with almost artistic precision, Schmidt practiced as a healer. He treated thousands of patients for ailments ranging from ulcers to infected sword wounds. By the end of his life, he was so respected as a physician that the city legally restored his honor, granting him full citizenship and the right to walk among polite society without being followed by the sound of people spitting. He even retired peacefully. No torches, no pitchforks, just a quiet home, presumably filled with bandages, herbs, and mildly traumatized grandchildren. A town's shame, until they needed him. It's poetic in a tragic way. Executioners were needed but shunned, essential yet exiled. Towns wanted justice, but preferred not to look at the person who physically delivered it. Until, of course, someone's back went out while lifting firewood. Then suddenly, the town's moral hierarchy relaxed. Yes, he may have dismembered a man yesterday, but today he realigned my spine. God works in mysterious ways. Let's drift now from the dusty outskirts of small medieval towns to the polished marble of royal courts, where executioners stepped into an entirely different world. Because being a town executioner was miserable enough, but being a royal executioner, now that was a uniquely confusing blend of prestige and permanent bad vibes. When the king wants someone dead, he doesn't swing the sword himself. Royalty, as a general rule, were very enthusiastic about punishment, but not particularly hands-on. Kings loved to decree death sentences with grand flair. Remove his head at sunrise. Or noon, whenever looks most dramatic. I'll be busy not lifting anything. So who carried out royal justice? Not the king. Not the nobility. Certainly not the clergy. They all agreed on one thing. We support justice, as long as someone else does the actual justice engine. And thus, the royal executioner became a permanent fixture of the palace payroll. You'd think that would earn respect. It did not. Prestige without proximity. Royal executioners were granted higher pay, lavish uniforms, sometimes even court accommodations. But they were still treated like medieval microwaves, useful, but unsettling. allowed inside the palace but not too far inside. You might be summoned for service. You might even be spoken to politely. But no one was going to invite you to sit near the royal children or touch anything upholstered. Professional rivalries, the axe-swinging Olympics. Executioners, being human, were occasionally competitive. In larger kingdoms, multiple executioners might be stationed in different regions. And sometimes, they'd compete for major executions like contractors bidding on high-profile contracts. Ah yes, the Duke is to be quartered? I hear Hans did the last one. Shame really. I'd have used finer ropes. There were even executioners famous for technique. Some preferred sword beheading, a cleaner, riskier style. Others swore by the axe, simpler, heavier, and more dramatic for the crowd. French executioners eventually embraced the guillotine, which was advertised as humane, if you ignore the fact that it was literally designed to sever heads more efficiently than previous options. The executioner who quit because he liked the victim. Occasionally, royal executioners faced a moral dilemma. What happens when you're ordered to execute someone you actually respect? One famous case comes from 17th century England. The condemned was a nobleman beloved by the people, and reportedly, even by the executioner himself. On the scaffold, the executioner was so visibly distraught that the condemned man had to comfort him. He said something like, "Please, dear duty, I forgive you. Let's both be efficient about this." Imagine that, being consoled by your client. The executioner hesitated. He delayed. He trembled. Eventually, he did it, but his hands shook so badly that he required multiple strokes. The crowd was furious. Not at the king, not at the law, but at the executioner, for not killing neatly. History really knew how to misplace blame when executioners refused. There were rare but notable moments when executioners refused outright, sometimes for moral reasons, more often because the sentence was physically absurd. There are recorded cases of executioners saying variations of, "You want me to burn him, then drown him, then boil him?"
No. Pick one.
I'm not assembling a theme park. In such cases, kings had to revise punishments, which must have been an awkward meeting. Very well, just the boiling. We'll let that settle for a moment. The sound of distant trumpets, silk robes, and somewhere in the shadows, a man polishing an axe, sighing deeply and wondering if he could have become a stonemason instead. Executioners prided themselves, strangely enough, on craftsmanship. If they had to do something terrible, they at least wanted to do it well, swiftly, precisely, ideally, without the crowd audibly gasping in horror. Because when executions went badly, it wasn't just tragic, it was embarrassing. For everyone, the gold standard. One stroke, no fuss. A well-executed execution, in the eyes of medieval society, meant one clean swing of the sword or axe. No screaming from either party. Minimal rolling. Executioners trained extensively for this. Some practiced on watermelons, others on animals, a few, disturbingly, on bags of sand shaped like people. Their goal wasn't just efficiency, it was honor. Even condemned criminals expected professionalism on their way out. One 18th century noble famously tipped his executioner for good aim, a preemptive gratuity, the medieval version of rating your Uber driver before the ride is over, when things went horribly wrong. Unfortunately, no amount of practice could prevent public disaster. Let's drift through a few truly unfortunate mishaps. Case 1. Mary, Queen of Scots, 1587. Her executioner reportedly missed twice before successfully removing her head. On the final swing, her little dog ran out from under her dress, which no one in attendance forgot for the rest of their lives. Case 2. The executioner who got nervous. A German record tells of an executioner who, overwhelmed by nerves, fainted before the first strike. The condemned man reportedly comforted him until he recovered, which means somewhere in history, a man about to die had to give a pep talk to the person ending his life. Case 3. The axe that would not cooperate. In one English execution, the axe was so dull that it took 5 blows, followed by a knife, and finally severing with bare hands. The crowd rioted. Not because of the death, but because of poor technique. They wanted efficiency, not horror. Executioners who botched jobs like these could face fines, public ridicule, or even revenge attacks from the victim's family. Professional standards were strict. The statistical champion, the world's most prolific executioner. If execution were a sport, deeply frowned upon as that concept may be, then Vasily Blokhin of the Soviet Union would hold the world record. Serving under Joseph Stalin, Blokhin personally carried out executions by pistol, night after night, for almost 3 decades. His estimated confirmed count? At least 7,000, possibly more. He is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific executioner of all time. His reward? A steady supply of vodka, medals, and eventually severe depression, followed by insanity. Because no matter how numb one tries to become, you cannot carry that much silence forever. When executioners became obsolete, as time crept onward, governments began shifting toward more efficient methods of execution. The guillotine replaced swords in France, advertised as humane because decapitation is apparently gentler if performed by an industrial machine. Hanging evolved from random rope lengths to mathematically calculated drops to ensure instant neck breakage. Firing squads crept in as the polite alternative. Less messy, more uniforms, easier to pretend no one person was responsible. Eventually, electrocution and injections emerged. Sanitized, sterile, bureaucratized. And with these innovations came a quiet extinction of the traditional executioner. No more masked figures with axes. No more hereditary houses on the edge of town. No more children inheriting shame like unwanted furniture. One by one, executioners were retired, absorbed, or simply forgotten. The job went from craft to procedure, from personal to administrative. Let's settle there for a moment. The fire has gone out. The axe hangs untouched. The crowd has left the square. All that remains is a man or woman, standing alone, wondering what they were in the eyes of history. Monster? Guardian? Technician? Or simply necessary? We've seen executioners feared, avoided, occasionally cheered, and often blamed for doing precisely what everyone else demanded of them. But what happened when the axe was put down for the last time? What became of the executioner after the final sentence was carried out? Surprisingly, some executioners managed to slip back into society. Not easily, not gracefully, but slowly, like a cat attempting to sit on fancy furniture after years of being told no. Career change, medieval edition. Executioners didn't often retire with pensions. There was no royal thank you for your service banquet. No commemorative plaque featuring an engraved noose. So when their hands grew unsteady, or their conscience finally outweighed their paycheck, many executioners had to reinvent themselves. Some transitions were logical, others the less so. Let's drift through a few real cases. The executioner who became an innkeeper. In 17th century Germany, one retired executioner opened a tavern. Now, you might think, wouldn't people avoid a place owned by a man who used to remove heads?
Yes.
They would, unless he made excellent beer.
And he did.
Word spread that the ale was strong, the stew was hearty, and the stools wobbled just enough to keep patrons humble. Eventually, locals stopped whispering, "Isn't that the man who dismembered Klaus the counterfeiter?" And instead said, "Isn't he the one who serves those delicious garlic dumplings?" Reputation replaced by carbohydrates. The executioner who became a judge. Another man, after decades of loyal service to the crown, was appointed a town magistrate, which raises several questions. Mainly, should the former executioner be the one deciding who gets executed? Apparently the answer was yes. Perhaps authorities figured, he's seen enough death. He'll be extra careful about sentencing. Or perhaps they simply ran out of qualified candidates. Regardless, court attendance reportedly increased out of sheer curiosity. From blade to Bible. Executioners turned clergy. There are scattered accounts, rare but real, of executioners who, late in life, turned deeply religious and became monks or priests. Not the glamorous cathedral kind. more like quiet countryside hermits who prayed constantly and ate vegetables mournfully. Some spent their remaining years atoning, copying manuscripts, or caretaking graveyards, which feels poetically appropriate. Just men trying to balance the scales quietly, one candle at a time. The executioner, who became a celebrity by accident. One of the most remarkable transformations was that of Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner we mentioned earlier. After executing nearly 400 people and healing several thousand, he retired.
But he didn't vanish.
Instead, he became a respected medical practitioner, treating nobles and commoners alike. People traveled great distances for his remedies. His past became less of a stain and more of a legend. He was no longer the man who killed. He was the man who understood death and helped others avoid it, which is probably the closest thing to cosmic irony history ever allowed. Not all endings were peaceful. Of course, not every executioner got a quiet retirement. Some were replaced by machines, guillotines, gallows, firearms, and found themselves obsolete. Not hated anymore. Just unnecessary. A few fell into alcoholism, unable to cope with the silence that followed years of noise. Others wandered, taking work as guards, debt collectors, or mercenaries, gravitating toward professions where people already assumed they were dangerous, so at least expectations were clear. But among all these endings, tragic, absurd, or quietly dignified, the question lingers. Were executioners villains? Heroes? Or simply tools? Perhaps none of the above. Perhaps they were just human beings, trapped in a profession that demanded precision without pride, authority without respect, and duty without friendship. Let's rest with that thought for a moment. The axe is gone. The tavern door is closing. A candle is burning on a quiet table. Somewhere out there, an old executioner sits alone, neither feared nor honored, just tired. If you're ready, we'll drift into part 7, where we'll change direction slightly and examine executioners in different cultures, samurai headsmen, Ottoman swordmasters, Chinese imperial enforcers, the polite rules of execution etiquette around the world, and why some cultures let the condemned choose their own death. When you're ready to continue, just say yes, and we'll keep wandering down this unusually peaceful path of historically regulated violence. So far, we've wandered mostly through European history, axes, gallows, guillotines, and awkward bakery interactions. But executioners were not uniquely European. Nearly every civilization invented legal killing and, predictably, invented someone to do it on schedule. Yet how those executioners were treated varied wildly, depending on the cultural flavor of justice. Let's drift across continents and centuries, peering quietly at how other societies balanced honor, horror, and practicality. Japan, the samurai executioner, deadly but stylish. In feudal Japan, execution could be elegant. Samurai were often required to perform executions themselves. Unlike in Europe, where nobles were coiled at physical involvement, Japanese lords were expected to uphold personal responsibility, even in formal decapitation. The most famous style was seppuku, a ritual suicide in which the condemned would disembowel themselves. But don't worry, there was a helper. Standing behind them was the kaishakunin, a designated assistant whose job was to decapitate them swiftly the moment they completed the first cut. This was considered merciful. A good kaishakunin could time the blade so perfectly that the victim died at the precise moment before pain overwhelmed consciousness. Bad ones were invited less frequently. Unlike European executioners, these swordsmen were respected, sometimes honored, partly because they only killed warriors, not common thieves or couriers who accidentally insulted the tax clerk. Makes a difference, apparently. The Ottoman Empire. Velvet diplomacy, followed by a sword. In the Ottoman court, execution could be extremely polite. If the Sultan wanted you removed, he did not dirty his hands. He simply sent a silk handkerchief delivered by 2 officials. If it was red, congratulations, you were promoted. If it was white, time to wrap it around your neck and cooperate. Strangling with silk was considered noble, as it shed no blood. Bloodshed in palaces was frowned upon, because it stained the carpets. Executioners in the Ottoman Empire were trained athletes capable of dispatching people quietly and efficiently. They were not despised. They were feared with admiration, the way someone might respect a tiger that occasionally attends formal events. China, the imperial headsman. In imperial China, executioners were considered necessary, but morally neutral. They performed Ling Chi, the infamous death by 1,000 cuts, as well as standard beheadings. Executioners were sometimes government employees with pensions, treated like soldiers of the legal system. They weren't honored, but they weren't exiled either. Some were even celebrated in folklore as justice bringers, slaying corrupt officials, or avenging wronged peasants. You know your society is unique when your executioner sometimes doubles as a folk hero. India, sacred death and strategic mercy. In some Indian kingdoms, executioners belong to specific caste groups tasked with handling death, not just executions, but also animal slaughter and funerary duties. This gave them a curious duality, associated with death, but often treated as ritual specialists, essential to religious cycles. They were not fully embraced by society, but not entirely shunned. Some rulers even allowed condemned nobles to choose their own method of death, believing that dignity in dying preserved family honor. Imagine getting options. Would Sir prefer poison, blade, or voluntary starvation in a room full of fruit he is not allowed to eat? One universal rule: proximity equals pollution. Despite cultural differences, one pattern emerges globally. People wanted executioners close enough to enforce justice, but not close enough to touch their stuff. They were hired, fed, and occasionally applauded, but rarely befriended. Whether they were samurai, state officials, or rope specialists, executioners lived in the same moral twilight. Vital, unwanted, respected,
Feared.
always a tool, rarely a person. For a profession defined entirely by obedience, you might assume executioners never argued, never hesitated, and certainly never declined. But they did. Not often, not loudly, and rarely without consequences. Yet scattered across history are quiet moments, strange, flickering spots of defiance, when the man with the sword simply refused. Let's dim the lights a little more and examine some of those rare occasions when the executioner decided that killing someone was more inconvenient than not killing them. The French executioner who refused to kill a dog. We begin gently with a dog. In 1750s France, a nobleman demanded that a local executioner hang his neighbor's dog for supposedly attacking his livestock. The executioner, perhaps surprised to be summoned for canine justice, inspected the criminal and discovered a very old, very friendly hound. The noble insisted. The executioner declined. He replied, politely, that his role was to execute humans, not household pets. The noble threatened him. The executioner said, effectively, "If you want it done, you hang the dog yourself." The noble backed down. The dog lived. And somewhere in the bureaucratic archives of France exists a line stating, "Refuse to hang dog. Reason: professionally inappropriate." The English headsman who delayed a beheading on purpose. In 16th century England, one executioner was ordered to behead a nobleman accused of treason. The condemned insisted on innocence and begged for more time to appeal. The authorities refused. So the executioner, rather than openly defy, simply developed sudden incompetence. He stalled. He mislaid his axe. He asked for new clothes because the weather was chilly for executions. He then reported that the blade needed sharpening and disappeared for hours. By the time he returned, a royal messenger had arrived with a pardon. The nobleman walked free, blissfully unbeheaded. The executioner was reprimanded, but not fired. After all, you can't easily replace a man whose job is legally murdering people with precision. The German executioner who quit on principle. Franz Schmidt, our beloved German executioner turned healer, once recorded a case in which he was ordered to torture a political prisoner beyond standard limits. He refused. He said execution was one thing, cruelty for entertainment was another. The magistrates protested. Franz calmly replied, "My office is to uphold justice, not to torment." Incredibly, they accepted this. which proves that even in medieval Germany, good posture and a calm voice could override sadism. The Ottoman executioner who broke tradition. Earlier, we discussed how Ottoman officials delivered silk handkerchiefs to signal execution. Well, one time, the designated executioner arrived at the condemned's home and found the man praying. The executioner waited. Minutes passed. More praying. Finally, the condemned paused and said, "You can proceed now." The executioner declined.
He said,
"I will not interrupt a man speaking to God." He returned later. The man was still praying. The executioner shrugged, left again, and reported, "Execution unnecessary. God has taken him first." The officials, faced with divine paperwork complications, let the matter go. Why these moments matter? These were not revolutionaries. They weren't saints. They were professionals whose job was horrific, but who occasionally opted for restraint over efficiency. They were, strangely enough, the last line of mercy in a system built for cruelty. We're nearing the end of our long, slow descent into this overlooked profession. Just one more stretch ahead. As centuries passed and societies claimed to have become more civilized, executioners didn't vanish overnight. They simply became less visible.
their tools changed.
Their platforms shrank. Their titles softened. But one by one, across the world, the last men of the scaffold quietly stepped away, no longer feared, no longer hated. Just unnecessary. Let's drift through the end of their era. The final heads in France. France, once so enthusiastic about public beheading that they brought lunch to executions, held onto its guillotine surprisingly long. In fact, the last guillotine execution in France was in 1977. Not 1677. 1977. The executioner's name was Marcel Chevalier, and he performed his final duty before dawn, quietly, efficiently, just as his predecessors had for centuries. Afterward, he was asked how he felt as France prepared to abolish capital punishment. He replied, "It's fine. I'll take a different job." Imagine transitioning from decapitator to municipal clerk. One day you oil blades. The next you file paperwork. History rarely provides graceful exits. Marcel took one anyway. Britain's last hangman. Britain's final official executioner was Albert Pierrepoint, who carried out over 400 hangings in his lifetime and afterward became a pub owner. His tavern was called Help the Poor Struggler. Make of that what you will. When asked if he believed capital punishment was effective, he gave a melancholy reply. It did not deter. I was only ever a technician. A man who once served as the state's most feared instrument, now handing out pickled onions and ale. America's transition, from rope to button. In the United States, executioners never had the same centralized identity. Hangings, shootings, and electrocutions were usually handled by local sheriffs, military officers, or designated contractors who preferred anonymity. By the late 20th century, states switched to lethal injection, often administered by medical technicians or prison staff behind closed curtains, sometimes pressing a button without knowing whether their button or another panel actually delivered the fatal dose. The goal was clear. No more singular executioner.
Just a system.
A process.
A machine.
The person delivering death was fractured, diffused, anonymized. Responsibility scattered like sand. Legally efficient. Morally evasive. The death of the executioner, not the death of execution. Most countries that abolished the profession kept its purpose. The act remains. The role has vanished. Modern justice systems prefer not to assign a face to state-sanctioned death. No identifiable man with a blade. No public leather apron. No one for the town to avoid at the market. Instead, a silent room, a sterile table, a switchboard. No executioner. Just execution. And so we end. The world no longer keeps men whose entire livelihood depends on ending others. At least, not officially. But perhaps the saddest truth of all is this. Executioners were never the architects of death. They were just the hands. The decision always belonged to someone else. A king. A judge. A politician.
A crowd.
The executioner simply stood where everyone else refused to stand. And for that, he bore the shame of a nation. If your eyes are closing, let them. History is quiet now. The scaffold is gone. The blade is cold. And somewhere in a forgotten archive lies a ledger full of names, written by steady hands that history chose to forget. Let's wade gently into one last topic, quieter than execution, but lingering just beneath it. We've asked who swung the axe. Now let's ask, where did all the bodies go? Because justice did not end with the final breath. Someone had to dispose of what remained. And just as executioners were tasked with ending lives, they were often tasked with hiding the evidence of them. Not in grand tombs, not in marked graves, but in rivers, pits, and lakes. Water as history's quietest graveyard. Across Europe and beyond, one pattern is remarkably consistent. Water swallowed the condemned. Bodies dropped into rivers, ashes swept into tides, bones scattered beneath bridges and docks. Why water? Because earth remembers. Water forgets. It carries things away. And executioners, already experts in efficient disappearance, knew this well. The lake behind the gallows. In medieval German towns, there were often designated execution ponds, small murky bodies of water just beyond city walls. After beheadings or drownings, bodies would be dragged, carted, or simply rolled into these ponds. No prayers, no markers, just a wet silence. Local children, naturally, were told never to swim there, which means they absolutely did. Generations later, fishermen would occasionally pull up things. The town would pretend not to notice. London's River of the Forgotten. In Tudor England, many condemned prisoners, especially those from Newgate or Southwark prisons, were not buried at all. Their corpses were tossed into the Thames. For centuries, London's river carried criminals, plague victims, and political enemies alike, all drifting together in indifferent currents. Sometimes, bodies washed up near taverns, where patrons would calmly report, "There's another one at the stairs. Mind the fish pies." Eventually, the city passed laws requiring weighted sacks. Progress. Lakes that kept secrets, until they didn't. In Eastern Europe, there are lakes rumored to be bottomless, not because they are deep, but because no one ever tried reaching the bottom. Old execution sites, now scenic picnic spots, sometimes surrender secrets when storms pull at their beds. Rusty shackles, jawbones, sword tips. Nothing dramatic, just quiet leftovers of distant justice. Tour guides rarely mention this. Ice cream stands are better for tourism. The executioner's last task. We've spoken of the guilt of killing, but imagine the weight of solitude when everyone goes home and you're left standing beside a body with nowhere to put it except water or ash. No priest, no mourner, no name. Just you, gravity, and a lake that never asks questions. Perhaps that, more than the executions themselves, was the heaviest burden. Being the ferryman for souls no one claimed. Let's leave those lakes undisturbed now. The surface is still. The past is submerged. And we have drifted far enough. Every culture that used execution eventually developed the same superstition. Those who die unjustly don't stay quiet. Whether tossed into rivers, left on gibbets, or buried at crossroads, the condemned were believed to complain. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough to ruin someone's sleep. The gibbet that wouldn't stop creaking. In 18th century England, executed criminals were sometimes hung in iron cages, left to rot in public as warnings. Villagers reported constant rattling, even on windless nights. The authorities insisted it was metal fatigue. The locals insisted it was Tom the highwayman asking to be let down. Children were dared to walk past after dark. Some returned calmly. Others returned running, pale, refusing to speak for days. The cage stayed up anyway. Justice, apparently, did not include rest. The headless walker of Würzburg. German folk tales speak of a decapitated nobleman who was executed incorrectly, meaning he was technically innocent, but politically inconvenient. He was denied burial rights and thrown into a pond near the gallows. For decades afterward, people claimed to see a tall figure walking around the pond at dusk, holding something under his arm. When approached, he reportedly said, "I'm just looking for the head they took." The pond eventually dried up. No one went near it. Not for farming, not for homes, not even for flowers. The land remained untouched, legally available, spiritually condemned. Executioners had their own ghost fears. Ironically, the people most wary of vengeful spirits were the executioners themselves. Many carried charms or whispered apologies into severed heads before disposal. One 17th century executioner recorded that he always said, "Forgive me, it was not my call." Not exactly comforting, but better than silence. Why ghost stories gather around the gallows? Perhaps it wasn't literal ghosts people feared. Perhaps it was memory, the past, refusing to stay buried. A whisper that says, justice is only justice when everyone believes it. And in many cases, they didn't. Let's let the ghosts rest now. The night is deep, the lake is still, and we've followed the condemned as far as they'll let us. If you want one more cursed execution tools, final meals, children of executioners, just say yes and I'll carry on. If not, we close the book here, softly. If the executioner carried the guilt, what about the tools? Because long after the hands that swung them grew old and still, the blades, ropes, blocks, and benches remained. Sometimes polished and passed down, sometimes quietly locked away, sometimes refusing to behave. The axe that wouldn't stay clean. In 18th century Scotland, there was a beheading axe so infamous that people swore blood reappeared on its edge, no matter how often it was scrubbed. Blacksmiths tried sanding it down. Priests sprinkled holy water. Housewives recommended vinegar. But every foggy morning, witnesses claimed a faint reddish sheen returned, as if the steel remembered its work. Eventually, it was buried. Not ceremoniously, just buried like a guilty secret. Some farmers claimed the grass above it grew faster. Others said slower. Either way, no one touched the patch. The rope they refused to reuse. Europeans were typically thrifty about execution ropes. Why waste good hemp on just one neck when it could serve dozens? But in one French village, a hangman retired early after 3 executions in a row went wrong. Not morally wrong, but mechanically strange. One rope snapped. The next slipped loose. The third simply untied itself. The priest declared the rope spiritually non-compliant. It was burned. The hangman refused to buy another. Justice paused until someone else volunteered. It took months. Guillotines that became furniture? After France abolished the death penalty in 1981, several dismantled guillotines were sold privately. Most were destroyed. A few went to museums. At least one was repurposed into a writing desk. The seller assured the buyer that no essential parts were included. The drawer still made a metallic clack when closed. The buyer moved it to the attic after 1 week. No explanation given. The executioner's toolkit, sold cheap, bought never. Whenever executioners died, their tools were often auctioned. Swords, masks, hooks, branding irons. And yet, buyers were rare. Even blacksmiths, who melted scrap metal for a living, refused to purchase them. One auctioneer noted in his ledger, "Items unsold. No one wants iron that has known sorrow." An unusually poetic remark for a man selling confiscated knives. Tools that asked for respect. Not literally, usually, but many executioners followed rituals. Always resting the axe on cloth. Never stepping over the rope. Never sitting on the chopping block. Superstition? Maybe. Or simply professional courtesy, extended toward objects that had seen too much. Let's set the steel down now. Let the wood dry. Let the rope coil in peace. Let's drift now to the quiet twilight of the profession. There came a point, inevitably, when executioners found themselves well unemployed. Not because crime had vanished. Humanity was still very much itself. But because efficiency had finally outpaced tradition. No one needed a man with an axe when they could have a machine with a lever. It began slowly. One kingdom would announce, proudly, that decapitation by sword was too barbaric. So they replaced it with beheading by engineered lunacy, the guillotine, which apparently was considered more humane because it was faster. Then someone in another country said, "Well, hanging is fine, but could we possibly calculate the perfect drop length so we don't accidentally strangle people slowly in front of horrified audiences?" And mathematicians, the most unexpected contributors to death, stepped forward eagerly with formulas. Executioners, once selected for strong arms and steady nerves, were now competing against pulley systems and gravity tables. Imagine explaining that at family dinner. "So, son, how is work?" "Mother, my axe was replaced by geometry." Some tried to adapt. A few former royal headsmen were reassigned as machine operators. Instead of swinging blades, they were now responsible for throwing switches. One man reportedly said it felt less like performing justice and more like starting a watermill. Others retired early, not out of choice, but because their faces no longer struck fear. Their role had become obsolete. The public did not whisper about them anymore. They simply forgot them, which, for a profession built on infamy, was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Let's drift a little further. Picture an old executioner, no longer summoned, his axe polished but unused. Children no longer run from him in the market, mostly because they don't recognize him at all. No one spits, but no one nods in respect either. He is not hated, not feared, not honored. He is unnecessary. And for a man whose entire existence relied on being the one necessary person at the worst possible moment, that was its own kind of sentence. Some became blacksmiths, others tavern keepers. A few simply vanished, taking their secrets with them. Because here's the quiet truth. Executioners carried more shame than pride. Even at their peak, they stood outside society. They were essential but unwanted, paid by the crown, judged by the crowd, feared by children, avoided by priests. And when their duty ended, when ropes and rifles replaced blades and axes, no one asked them who they were beneath the title.
No one asked what it did to them.
Were they butchers? Were they guardians? Or were they simply civil servants, following instructions written by hands far cleaner than theirs? Let's rest on that for a moment. A fire guttering in an empty square, an axe hanging on a wall, untouched, its blade reflecting only dust. And somewhere a person who did terrible things so others wouldn't have to. Not a monster, not a hero, just necessary. Now, if being an executioner was awkward, being the child of one was a lifelong social obstacle course. You could be the brightest student in town, the most polite, clean-shoed, him singing Little Angel.
Didn't matter.
Everyone still knew who sharpened your father's axe. The inherited stain. Executioner jobs often passed down the family line, not by glory, but by sheer lack of alternatives. If your father was an executioner, odds were good that you would be, too.
Why?
Because respectable tradesmen wouldn't apprentice you. Noblemen wouldn't knight you. Priests wouldn't even let you sweep the church floor. So, congratulations, son. Here's your family business. Lifetime supply of bloodstains and awkward stares. The schoolyard situation. Children of executioners were usually segregated, either literally or informally. In some towns, they weren't allowed to play with the good kids. In others, they could join in as long as they were the villain in every game. Let's play knights and dragons. Okay, you be the dragon. No, you be the executioner. Some records suggest executioners' children were required to wear distinctive clothing, marking them as untouchable. A medieval version of being born with a giant do not befriend sign. Marriages that weren't. And when those children grew up, good luck finding a spouse. Most townsfolk would sooner marry a cowherd with fleas than the son of an executioner. So executioner families often married other executioner families. Yes, you heard that correctly. Dynasties of head-chopping households. Entire bloodlines wrapped in hereditary shame, producing generation after generation of children doomed to sit alone at the edge of the village feast. The house on the edge of town. Executioner families rarely lived in the heart of town. They were given or banished to homes near the gallows at the fringes of society. So their children grew up surrounded by a very strange sort of backyard. Other children had gardens. Executioners' children had swinging corpses. Bedtime lullabies included creaking ropes and the occasional crow. It's safe to say it didn't build confidence. A brief moment of respect. But here's the irony. If an executioner's child learned healing skills, bone setting, wound stitching, herbal remedies, the town might quietly depend on them. Not openly, of course. Publicly, unclean family, keep away. Privately, my knee aches, can your father see me at midnight? So the children, like their parents, lived double lives. Outcasts at dawn, essential workers by dusk, the quiet resilience. And yet, against all odds, some of them flourished. Records mention executioners' children who went on to respectable professions once they escaped to a different city where no one recognized their surname. But most stayed. Most inherited the axe. And most lived within the strange twilight of being needed, but never welcomed.